Welcome to Eric Hurst's Training for Climbing podcast. Training for Climbing podcast. Training for climbing. Training for climbing. Training for climbing.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Training for Climbing podcast. I'm Eric Hurst from trainingforclimbing.com, back with a continuation of podcast number 23, which was released just a few days ago. This a supersized episode of the Training for Climbing podcast. We're taking a deep look at the anaerobic lactic energy system, and the last podcast was getting up close to an hour, and so to limit the length of these podcasts, to limit the size of the download, I've decided to break it into two parts. And so this is part two. If you haven't listened to the first part of this episode, well then please hit pause, go back, and play episode 23 first, because it's a really in-depth look at the science, the bioenergetics of the energy systems that contribute to make ATP, that's the fuel for muscular contraction, and it really does help to have a grasp of some of the science so that you can understand some of the method to the madness when it gets to training, and also just how you want to climb on rock, because there are implications on how you can climb more effectively based on your knowledge of energy systems and the constraints of these energy systems. So this is a rich topic, something that we started looking at last month with the podcast on the anaerobic alactic energy system, and we'll continue next month with the final podcast in the series, which is a look at the very important aerobic energy system. And so in this podcast, we're going to wrap up the anaerobic lactic energy system. That is the system which really dominates in generating ATP at a very high rate in sustained climbing and exercising lasting between about 15 seconds and a minute or two. It's kind of that bridge energy system that fills the gap between the short-term high-energy phosphates, that's the ATP-CP system that dominates for just short, brief, maximal movements, and the aerobic energy system, which dominates after a couple of minutes of sustained activity, of course at a much lower power rate. So this anaerobic lactic system is really called into play when you're doing a longer boulder problem or a long crux sequence on a sport climb, or a traditional climb for that matter, where you need to really work hard and climb at a very high power output for 30 seconds or a minute or even 2 minutes without any quality rest. Those are the situations that tax this anaerobic lactic energy system. And so in this podcast, we're going to look at just how you can best train that energy system and get adaptations that will help ramp up your power endurance, your anaerobic capacity to the next level. But before we get to the nitty-gritty details and the types of workouts you can do to take your anaerobic lactic system to the next level, I first want to do a quick recap of the last podcast, of podcast number 23, and just review briefly the adaptations that we're after. If you do targeted anaerobic lactic energy system training, what is your goal? What are the adaptations that we're trying to spin up or upregulate to help increase your anaerobic capacity? And I often point out that these adaptations are something that play out pretty quickly. If you do a dedicated block of as brief as 2 or 3 weeks and maybe up to 4 or 5 or 6 weeks, you can get your anaerobic capacity. You can get these adaptations to spin up about as high as they're going to go, given your current maximum strength and muscle efficiency and the support of the aerobic energy system, the aerobic power that kind of underlies and supports the anaerobic system. And so this is something that you don't train year-round, but instead want to train in blocks, with a block of this training being the final thing you do before you taper into a period of performance climbing. like a road trip, or if you're going to be going on the competition circuit, or working a big project, you want to do all your other training and then finish up with, say, 2 to 4 weeks of more targeted anaerobic lactic energy system training to get these last-minute adaptations to spin up. Adaptations that, by the way, will go away pretty quickly if you take a few weeks off. And what we're talking about is, number one, intracellular buffering. This is the first line of defense against those protons that are produced during anaerobic glycolysis that lead to an acidic environment inside the cell. So that intracellular buffering kind of fights off the first burst of proton generation inside the working cell. Doesn't last long, but it is kind of the first line of defense. It's important because as pH drops inside of the cell, it negatively impacts an enzyme called PFK, which is the anaerobic enzyme that catalyzes the glycolytic process. And so your goal with anaerobic lactic training is to reduce the proton load and also to try to increase that PFK enzyme. And combined, the effect is a higher rate of glycolysis, an upregulation at the rate that you can break down glycogen and yield ATP, at least early on in the first, say, 15 to 30 seconds of high-intensity exercise. Now, as that sustained exercise, that high-intensity exercise continues to 45 seconds, to a minute and beyond, you can't keep up with it. And so the body has another process to deal with the drop in pH or the rise in generation of these hydrogen ions, and that's the formation of lactate. In the last podcast, you learned about byproducts of anaerobic glycolysis are pyruvate and these hydrogen ions. And with the help of an enzyme called LDHA, that pyruvate can be turned into lactate and then transported out of the cell by a lactate transporter. So the critical enzymes are an LDH that helps facilitate the formation of lactate, and then MCT1 that helps co-transport a lactate and another hydrogen ion out of the cell into the bloodstream. And in doing so, this efflux of lactate and ions helps control the drop in the pH inside of the cell so that glycolysis can continue and perhaps even accelerate if you can have a rapid enough transport of lactate and these hydrogen ions out of the muscle cell. So these are all processes that we're trying to train up with workouts targeting the anaerobic lactic energy system. Now, supporting the anaerobic lactic system is the aerobic energy system, which is pretty much operating all the time. It becomes the primary source of ATP production as power output falls, as the anaerobic system runs aground. A fate, by the way, that is hastened by the occlusion of blood flow. In your forearms, when you bear down very hard to grip a hold at a high finger flexor force, you occlude blood flow. And by preventing flow of fresh oxygen into the muscle and also flow of byproducts out of the muscle, intracellular pH drops very fast and lactate production rises very fast and can't even get out of the cell. And so in that situation, your power output drops precipitously. And so keeping blood flow moving through the muscle is important. Keeping your gripping of each handhold as brief as possible, at least when you're gripping hard, like in a crux sequence, is important, because the more brief that occlusion of blood flow is, the more readily you can remove those byproducts and get fresh oxygen and actually have the aerobic energy system contributing some power to the equation. And so the aerobic energy system is running in the background, and long-term, spinning up that aerobic energy system, both power and capacity, is very important to taking your climbing performance to the next level. And we'll dig into that topic in the next podcast. But let me just say for now that those aerobic adaptations take a long time. And so the training you do to spin up the aerobic energy system to get you these long-term adaptations to increase aerobic power and to enhance the aerobic support of the anaerobic system, they take months and years to spin up, whereas the anaerobic lactic specific adaptations only take weeks to spin up. And that's why you can do a shorter block of this lactic training and get positive results, knowing that those adaptations are specific to the anaerobic system. And the underlying aerobic energy system adaptations, well, you have to invest a lot more time long term to get those adaptations. And what I'm talking about is increasing capillary density. The more capillaries you have surrounding the cell and between the fibers, the more readily you can get oxygen into the cell and lactate out of the cell and hydrogen ions out of the cell and kind of flush things out of the working muscle. Ultimately, the long-term goal is to decrease the diffusion distance between the cytosol inside the muscle cell and the capillaries that surround the cell so that you can get lactate and hydrogen ions out of the cell and oxygen into the cell as quickly and easily as possible. And then, of course, mitochondria, which are the basis, the engines that create ATP via the oxidative pathway, via the aerobic energy system. And we'll talk a lot about mitochondria in the next podcast, but let me just say that a long-term commitment to training the aerobic energy system will increase mitochondria density and respiration. So both the number of mitochondria and also how much ATP individual mitochondria can crank out. And so that is hugely important to processing and oxidizing pyruvate and cleansing lactate from your system, and also just generating ATP rapidly via the aerobic pathway, which will increase your aerobic power, which increases power production at any given moment and also increases your rate of recovery during rest periods. And then there's the more generalized aerobic adaptations, like increasing blood volume and stroke volume. And those are adaptations you can get from generalized aerobic training, like running or swimming or biking or activities such as that we'll talk a little bit about in the next podcast. So again, with the anaerobic lactic training, the ultimate goal are the specific adaptations of the lactic system, which you can spin up to a higher level in just a matter of a few weeks, recognizing that the aerobic energy system does play a supporting role, but that those adaptations take longer term and are something you have to work on month and season over season. Okay, moving on here. Before we get into some training protocols, I want to go on just a brief tangent. So start tangent now. And this tangent relates to just reaffirming the difference between anaerobic power and anaerobic capacity and how you might test yourself to see how you fare in one or the other. Anaerobic power is the maximum rate of ATP production via the anaerobic energy system. And so we're talking about like in a 5-second burst, how much ATP can you generate or really break down to fuel exercise to generate muscle power. And so tests of this have to be brief and maximal and have some way to gauge power output or work done in, say, a 5 or at most 10-second period. And so there's not a really solid, validated way to do this yet with climbers, but there are a variety of techniques out there that can give you a sense of things. On a campus board, you can do something called a slap test, where you pull up with both hands side by side as hard as you can, and then slap as high as you can. It's basically like a vertical jump for climbers, except you're doing you're testing your arm power rather than your leg power. And so the higher you can slap, the greater anaerobic power you have at your given body weight. You could do something like a gym rope climb. That's something we do here at our house. We have one of those thick gym ropes that you climb arm over arm. It's about 18 feet long. And so we can do a stopwatch and time how long it takes to climb that 18 feet and touch the top. Again, it takes just a few seconds, but a more powerful climber will be able to do that more quickly. So again, a gym rope climb for time would be a pretty good assessment of anaerobic power. Some people are starting to play around with accelerometers to, again, do a campus board test, but with an accelerometer to measure acceleration or rate of force development. Another relatively simple test would be to see how many pull-ups you could do in 10 seconds. So a more powerful climber, in theory, should be able to do more pull-ups in 10 seconds than a less powerful climber. And finally, and perhaps ultimately the most valid test when it comes to finger flexor force, would be a 5-second peak finger force test. And this is something that I'm starting to test climbers in. There's a number of other coaches beginning to test climbers in. It's a tough exercise to control so that you can compare results because every fingerboard or tester uses a little different technique. But there's a device coming out, a finger force tester, that's going to hit the market later this year that I'll be presenting and showing you more about that I've been testing, and I think it's really going to be the gold standard for giving a very accurate measurement of 5-second peak finger force, which of course would be higher for a climber with a higher anaerobic power in their finger flexor muscles. So, there's a few tests there you can play around with and, test yourself, do a training block, test yourself again, and see if your anaerobic power has increased. When it comes to testing anaerobic capacity, well, in the exercise physiology business, the gold standard is a 30-second wind gate. It's basically a 30-second all-out rowing test or a cycling test done in a lab where they can measure how much work is done in 30 seconds. It's a grueling 30-second all-out test. And, those first 30 seconds, the majority of the ATP generated is via the anaerobic energy system. And so that 30-second wind gate provides a nice assessment of one's anaerobic capacity, which, of course, on a rowing machine or bike is an assessment more of lower body anaerobic capacity. Now, applying that to climbing, well, that's kind of more difficult. Again, there's no perfect way to do it that's been developed just yet. I use a tread wall and do a 1-minute climbing power test, a very simple test, which kind of a climber climbs in a neutral position, and so it attempts to remove kind of the variability of body position and climbing efficiency and just tests more how fast you can pull and climb on the tread wall. I guess you could do a similar test on a campus board where you see how many rungs a climber can campus up and down in, say, a 30-second or 1-minute period. You could use the Nycro's hit strip system on like a 45-degree wall and similarly do a timed test of 30 seconds to a minute and see how many hand moves you can do on the hit strip system. And actually, I have a new machine I'm beginning to use that I'm a big fan of. It's called Endless Rope. It's kind of like a treadmill for your arms. And although it doesn't stress the finger flexors, it does stress the pulling muscles in a very climbing specific way. And so doing a 30-second endless rope test and seeing how many feet of rope you can pull in 30 seconds would be a pretty valid test, at least in the pulling muscles, of anaerobic capacity. That would be, again, the measure of the volume of ATP that you can generate and break down to create power in a given period of time. That's what we're talking about. Capacity is total ATP production in a given period of time, whereas anaerobic power is all about rate of ATP production, how much power you can generate in a short burst, like in, say, 5 seconds. Final comment. I also do lactate testing, and what I like to do, which I believe gives a good feel for the strength of a climber's anaerobic capacity, is to do a climb to failure. Again, I use my tread wall and have the climber climb as long as they can, and eventually they will reach failure. It might take 2.5 minutes. It might take 5 or 6 minutes. So yes, a portion of the ATP production from that test is via the aerobic energy system because it lasts 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 minutes in duration. But a long test to failure will also maximally tax the anaerobic lactic energy system. And so as the system's failing, of course, the aerobic energy system is taking over, but blood lactate levels are still increasing 2, 3, even 4 or 5 minutes into a climb to failure. And so once the climber reaches failure, you take a lactate measurement, and I usually take another one 30 seconds and a minute after the climber has failed because the lactate content will actually go up a little more after they stop climbing because it takes time to get that lactate out of the cell and into the bloodstream. But long story short, the higher the blood lactate, the higher the anaerobic capacity, and the higher the tolerance to lactate and to acidosis that a climber has. So if I measure a climber that on a climb to fail test has a lactate measurement of 14 millimoles per liter compared to a climber that does a climb to failure and has 10 millimoles per liter, well then the first climber who had a higher blood lactate has a stronger anaerobic lactic energy system. Okay, so there's kind of a long-winded explanation into how coaches and sports scientists, climbing researchers are trying to be able to do some targeted testing of the climbing performance or the climbing specific muscles. Again, these tests need to be refined and validated and controlled, and only then can we kind of compare results from one coach to another. There's, I guess to finish up this tangent here, there's a lot of variability in testing from one coach to another. Even if they are following the exact same sheet, the same protocol, the same tests, little things make big differences. For instance, the equipment used. The test might say use a 20 millimeter crimp edge to do fingerboard testing. But every fingerboard is a little different in terms of the frictional properties, and so they will yield slightly different measurements. Ambient conditions, differences in temperature and relative humidity. Is there a fan blowing over the fingerboard or not? Make significant differences when a coach is testing day to day, or even different coaches in different regions, different locations. That will affect the testing. The quality of the warm-up affects fingerboard testing, finger flexor testing, power testing in a big way. If the climber is more warmed up one day than another, they're going to test better. Or if they're not fully recovered, or if they didn't eat right, or if they drank the night before. There are so many things that affect the results of a fitness test. And perhaps the biggest is whether the coach, the tester, is giving verbal encouragement or not to the person being tested. In a lab setting, pretty much every research study you read says the athlete was given strong verbal encouragement. You have to do that because it makes like a 10% difference. It's pretty dramatic if you do or don't give verbal encouragement. And so a test can be basically rigged if a coach doesn't give you verbal encouragement the first time or doesn't warm you up properly the first time, and then they test you a month later and they get you warmed up and they give you verbal encouragement and they're like, hey, look, my training program gave you 10% more strength in your fingertips, but was it really that you're stronger, or was it that you had verbal encouragement and a good warm-up and a good night's sleep? And so you get where I'm going. This whole testing thing, though it's admirable and it's important to build and work towards kind of proven, validated tests, we're not quite there yet. And so just kind of buyer beware if you're submitting yourself to be tested, or if you're having your test results put in a database. There's probably not as much correlation or accuracy behind the testing and behind the database as you would like to think there is. In the future, I think we're going to get there, but it's still a work in progress. Okay, so now's the time we can finally move on to some training protocols. And in training up anaerobic capacity, of course, the goal is to improve your power endurance, your finger strength endurance, But that's a pretty broad target and doesn't provide enough nuance. And so what I do is to break anaerobic capacity training into 3 categories. Because there's a big difference between training 15-second power endurance and 2-minute power endurance. And so the 3 categories, the first is what I call high-end power endurance. That's bursts, very high intensity, 15 to 30 seconds in length. And you would kind of power out or reach failure before or by 30 seconds of duration. That is called high-end power endurance. Then there's intermediate power endurance. And this is what I think most people loosely refer to as anaerobic capacity. And that is your ability to generate relatively high power output for 40 to 60 seconds. And this is crucial for those longer cruxes on routes that take up to a minute to get from one rest to another. Trying to maintain high power output for upwards of a minute requires a strong anaerobic lactic energy system. So that's the intermediate power endurance category. And then finally is kind of long anaerobic endurance, or what you might call transitional, from 1 to 2 or 3 minutes in length. And those efforts, of course, the aerobic energy system is increasingly becoming the primary source of ATP production. I covered this in depth in the last podcast, but at around 1 minute or 75 seconds, there's a crossover where the anaerobic system is fading quickly and the aerobic energy system becomes the dominant player in terms of ATP production. Now, depending on the strength of your aerobic system, your aerobic power, and depending on the strength of your anaerobic system, your anaerobic capacity, that crossover point could be at 45 seconds, it could be at 75, or maybe even 90 seconds if you have a really strong anaerobic system, a high anaerobic capacity. But on average, it's my experience that crossover is between 60 seconds and 75 seconds, and that's when your power output falls off a cliff. Remember I said about Adam Andra on Silence and Margot Hayes on Biography, how both of them climbed the crux sections, and both routes have multiple crux sections, and in pretty much every case, they did it in under 60 seconds. If it would have taken any longer, they probably wouldn't have made it through the crux because their power output would have dropped off too much that they wouldn't have been able to make it to the rest. And so that intermediate power endurance category, the training of 40 to 60 seconds, I think that's what's missing from a lot of people's programs and where there's a lot of gold to be mined. It seems to me a lot of people train high-end power, the 15 to 30 seconds. If you do a lot of short bouldering, that's the system you're training a lot. If you're moonboarding, you're training that high-end power endurance system, that 15 to 30 seconds. Or if you do a lot of roped climbing, if you spend a lot of time climbing pumped, you're more in that long anaerobic capacity or that transitional category I talked about, the 1 to 2 to 3 minute power endurance, the really pumpy, painful, long endurance training category. And that's the one that actually leads to overtraining most often because it's very stressful on your system at a cellular level. It's hard on the enzymes. It can even damage mitochondria if done too much. And it's what people tend to do at the crags. If they're sport climbing, they get pumped a lot, and you're in kind of that long anaerobic capacity category. And so without further ado, let's move on to training here and talk about how to best train each of those 3 categories of anaerobic capacity. Okay, so the first category is the high-end power endurance, and our goal here is to build the volume of ATP you can generate at a very high power output to support a very high power output for 15 to 30 seconds. And quite simply, your goal is to do all-out efforts, whatever the exercise may be, for 15 to 30 seconds with a long rest in between repetitions. So you could do, like I said, you could do bouldering reps where you're working on a max boulder problem that takes 15 to 30 seconds. You could do, system wall or moon boarding where you try a maximum or do a near maximal problem that takes 15 to 30 seconds. The work to rest ratio should be at least 1 to 10. So if you're doing a problem or an exercise that lasts 30 seconds, well, then you should be resting about 300 seconds, or 5 minutes between repetitions. So you're spending most of your time resting, but that allows for near complete recovery in terms of getting hydrogen ions and lactate out of the working cells and to get back to homeostasis so that those anaerobic enzymes can function fully to create ATP rapidly on your next effort. If you make your recovery periods too short, then you're not getting the desired adaptations. A few other exercises that kind of fit this category: on a hangboard, if you did a 7-second hang, 3-second rest repeater 3 times, that would take you about 30 seconds. Now, you'd probably need to use a pretty small hold or add weight to your body if you're using a larger hold, like a 20 millimeter edge or a pocket, because you want the exercise to be near maximal. In terms of pull-up training, you could do like a 20-second max set of pull-ups. How many can you do in 20 seconds? And then rest for 3 to 5 minutes and repeat and do maybe up to 5 sets. On a tread wall, what we often do is a 30-second max effort. So you're climbing on really small holds. Often we add weight to our body, and we're paddling and climbing as hard as we can for 30 seconds. Not really striving to do technically difficult moves, but trying to do powerful moves. We're trying to express and put into the tread wall as much power, as much force as we can. So we're moving quickly, and that means we're not doing maximal moves, at least not in terms of technical difficulty, but we sure are doing what feel like maximal moves in terms of effort. So again, the goal is 15 to 30 seconds of near maximal effort, followed by a long rest of 3 to 5 minutes. Again, most of this workout is time spent resting and recovering. And when you are climbing, it's a maximal effort, but it's so brief that you're not pumping out, but you're kind of powering out. If you're getting pumped, well, then you're probably climbing too long. You're probably going for more than 30 seconds. Remember, the training goal is to stay between 15 and 30 seconds and really target the enzymes that facilitate a high ATP flux, but yet via the short sets not getting all that acidic or not getting all that pumped. And so the adaptations here are quite specific to intracellular buffering and the anaerobic enzymes. To best train up these enzymes, I recommend doing 5 to 10 sets per session, with an elite climber building up to as many as 15 sets per session. Of course, you need to get the intensity right, and the intensity is pretty much all out. On a scale from 1 to 10, I like to say your effort should be a 9.5 to a 10 out of 10. So you're going all out for 15 to 30 seconds. Any less than that, and the ATP flux isn't high enough, isn't rapid enough, isn't voluminous enough to kind of garner the adaptations we're after here. Okay, so let's move on to the second category, and that is the intermediate power endurance, 40 to 60 seconds. How much ATP you can generate and split in 40 to 60 seconds. So it's kind of that intermediate anaerobic capacity. It's what a lot of people call power endurance because it's that period where your power does start to drop off quickly when you're on a climb. And it's this duration of exercise or of intense climbing where you do start to feel a pump begin to build. You do feel some burning developing in your working muscles. You will begin to sense some breathlessness. Your breathing rate will pick up. You might, by the 60 seconds, be almost gasping for breath if you're working at kind of a peak power output. And these are all signs of increasing lactate production, increasing hydrogen ion production, and decreasing pH, or in other words, increasing intracellular acidosis. And in the last podcast, I explained kind of the implications and the impacts of that dropping pH. Ultimately, your body starts to shut down glycolysis, kind of as a self-protective mechanism, and hence your power output begins to drop precipitously. As I said, off a cliff as you get to around a minute of all-out climbing. And so the adaptations we're after here is upregulation of the anaerobic enzymes and transporters like LDHA and MCT1. The quicker we can make lactate and co-transport the lactate and hydrogen ion out of the cell, the more quickly anaerobic glycolysis can continue to crank out ATPs without running aground. And so, as you might expect, the goal here is to train in that 40-second to 60-second window at a very high intensity. And so, in using my training zone scale, you're kind of shooting for around a 9. So, when you're starting out your set, it should be hard, but not instantly maximal. But as you get into that 30 to 40 second time frame, it's going to get hard, and you should be failing or approaching failure by 60 seconds. Exercises to do in this training zone. Well, you can be creative. Pretty much anything you would do that's relatively climbing specific and high power output and kind of all out in nature that lasts 40 to 60 seconds fits the bill. Examples? Well, on a pull-up bar, an exercise that I call Frenchies is perfect for targeting the pulling muscles of your upper arms, shoulders, and back. You know, I popularized this exercise, I think like 25 years ago in one of my early magazine articles or in my first book, and it's really become a staple of many climbers. If you're not familiar with the Frenchie, it's a pull-up, but with pauses, with a lock-off at the top, at the middle position, like at a 90-degree elbow angle, and then just above the bottom position. And those 3 isometric lock-offs are each held for 3 seconds, separated by 1 pull-up. And so the pull-up gives you some muscle pump, but the lock-offs also have the opposite effect of occluding blood flow and making it a more anaerobic environment. And so you do 6 or 9 or 12 of these Frenchie pull-ups, and it is grueling. Most people can't go more than about 60 seconds when they're doing Frenchies. And if you can continue for more than 60 seconds, well, then you're strong enough to add weight to your body in doing them. And so doing 3 to 5 sets of these Frenchies would be a good candidate for training the larger pulling muscles for this intermediate power endurance. On a hangboard, the 7-second, 3-second repeater protocol done 6 times in a row, which would take essentially about a minute, that classic repeater protocol is an excellent strength endurance protocol for the finger flexors. And again, you can vary your grip between half crimp and open crimp, or doing open hand pockets and do a set for each grip. You could do a pinch grip exercise in a repeater format. And as long as you're training in that 40 to 60 second window and at a near all-out intensity, then you're getting the desired stimulus and you will get the desired adaptations. Another option is to do ladder laps on the large rungs of a campus board, going up and down for 30 to 60 seconds. Or you could climb around on a system wall or moon board or bouldering wall. As long as it's high intensity, perhaps you have to add some weight to your body to make it high intensity enough that you can get a 9 out of 10 intensity effort in that 40 to 60 second period. We use a tread wall a lot because that's an easy tool to add weight or to vary hold size and speed of climbing to kind of scale power output to make it just right for each individual climber. But no matter the platform or the exercise that you're using to train this intermediate power endurance, you want to do a work-to-rest ratio of about 1 to 5. So if you're climbing for 60 seconds, a minute, you'd want to rest for about 5 minutes. And you won't get complete recovery in 5 minutes, but you will get mostly recovered in terms of removal of lactate out of the working muscles and renewal of intercellular high-energy phosphates and the removal of hydrogen ions. You probably won't get back to homeostasis, but you'll get close enough that you'll be able to continue with your next set at a near maximal power output. And again, the goal is 40 to 60 seconds with a 9 out of 10 effort in terms of your perceived exertion or intensity level. In terms of the number of training sets, well, someone new to this, probably just 4 sets, whereas an advanced climber 8 and an elite climber as much as 10 or 12 sets. So with a 5-minute rest between sets, this can get to be a pretty long workout. It can easily turn into about a 1-hour session, and that doesn't include, of course, warm-up time and then any other additional exercises that you would do when you're done training this intermediate power endurance. And by the way, people often ask me, can I do other exercises during my rest breaks? That is an efficient way to train. And it really depends on what you're doing. Obviously, you don't want to do anything that stresses the muscles that you're training, your forearms and your pulling muscles. So you would not want to do fingerboard or pull-ups between these 40 and 60 second intense efforts. But doing something like some easy core exercises, doing some planking or a set of crunches, pulling on a rowing machine for a few minutes would actually be a good thing. That's something that we do to kind of expedite recovery. Kind of that active recovery mode helps circulate blood and actually helps slow twitch fibers elsewhere in your body consume and oxidize lactate and get you back closer to your starting state for your next set. So yes, some active recovery would be good as long as it's not stressful. Okay, on we go to the third category of power endurance training, and that is what I call long endurance or long duration anaerobic capacity. And this is where you're climbing for 1 to as long as 3 minutes, a near maximal effort. It won't seem maximal for the first 30 seconds to a minute, but the intensity level is high enough, say 80% from the get-go, that by the time you get to a minute and a half and 2 minutes and 2.5 minutes, you are getting very pumped and it's getting very painful and you're getting out of breath, and you should literally be fighting to hang on to get those last few moves, to get those last few seconds of exercise. And this is the type of training that is not only the most grueling, but it's the most stressful on your body. And so stress is kind of a good thing in a way, in that it's what triggers your body to adapt. These types of grueling 1 to 3 minute efforts result in a very high proton load and therefore expose your body to the most acidic conditions and also the highest lactate content. And so those are triggers, those are signals for adaptation. And so if you do one of these grueling, long power endurance sessions where you're doing several of these all-out 1 to 3 minute climbs or exercise sets, if you give yourself a few days to recover, you will be a stronger climber with a higher anaerobic capacity as a result. And the adaptations from this type of workout are profound. Literally 1 or 2 sessions can yield a noticeable difference in anaerobic capacity. as enzymes and buffering spin up in a matter of days. Again, these anaerobic lactic enzymes respond quickly to training. These types of workouts are what a climber gets if, let's say, they go to an area like the Red River Gorge or Rifle for a few weeks, and their first week there, they don't feel like they're very fit. They get pumped out really quickly, and all of a sudden, week 2, they kind of find their fitness. Well, that is because that first week, they, in climbing a few days, presumably, got really pumped. They were doing these types of exercise burns, 1 to 3 minutes of maximal efforts, like working on a route at their limit and then falling and hanging and then resting and doing it all over again. And so you do a few days of this at a crag on a trip, and your body will spin up some of these short-term adaptations quite quickly and give you some positive results. Again, the assumption being you take enough rest days for the adaptations to occur. If you're climbing 6 out of 7 days in a row, well, then you're going to probably go the other direction in terms of getting very fatigued and very stressed out and kind of almost overtrained from the lack of recovery. So in any case, this type of training can be very effective, but it's also something that a lot of climbers tend to do too much of. Because if they're climbing 2 days a week at the crags, and working really hard, projecting, climbing at their limit, and getting really, really pumped, well, this is kind of what they're training in those 2 days at the crags. And then if they go back into the gym and do 2 sessions during the week of the exact same thing, well, then they've had 4 workouts in a 1-week period that are almost identical. And the logic, is that, well, I'm training specific to how I'm going to climb in the weekend, but the science doesn't really back that up as being effective, because doing the same workout 4 days in a week, especially this workout, which is very stressful, will tend to feed back and give you negative results. If not in the first week, certainly in the second and in the third week. And so these types of workouts have to be programmed in a rather conservative nature. And if you are climbing and getting pumped on the weekends, well, then during the week, you want to probably be doing more of a strength and power session early in the week, and then more of an aerobic endurance session midweek, and then resting, say, Thursday and Friday before you go climb outside and get pumped again on the weekends. And that way, you're kind of training other energy systems during the week and allowing these anaerobic lactic adaptations from your weekend climbing to play out. And that is a better kind of in-season strategy. Now, if you have a period, kind of a few weeks off or an off-season, then you can do more of a dedicated block. And we'll talk more about the programming in just a moment. But let's talk a bit about specifics here. In terms of training this long power endurance, your goal is to exercise or climb for 1 to at most 3 minutes in what is about an 8 or 8.5 out of 10 in terms of your perceived exertion or effort. Although by the time you get to 3 minutes, you're going to be near failure. You should be very pumped and feeling quite a bit of pain in the working muscles and likely be out of breath when you step off the climbing wall. You don't necessarily have to go to failure. I would argue that that's not essential, but you should get pretty close during this 1 to 3 minute climbing burn. And, this is kind of the true lactic tolerance training where you get used to climbing pumped. It's one part physiological tolerance that you acquire through upregulation of buffering and enzymes that help you persevere during periods of high lactate and low pH, but also you adjust mentally, learning to climb pumped, kind of keeping it together, keeping your technique together, maintaining good climbing posture and efficient movement when you get pumped out can sometimes be difficult, and elite climbers are really good at that. Their style just never breaks down, whereas a newer climber, when they get pumped, they tend to overgrip and things snowball and their climbing technique and their footwork falls apart. And so the training adaptations you get are not only physiological, but also technical and mental. So again, this is very effective training for a number of reasons. You just don't want to do too much of it. So in any case, after a lengthy warm-up and maybe some bouldering or a little bit of performance climbing, you can then move on to doing a few sets of these long power endurance burns, 1 to 3 minutes at an 8 or 8.5 out of 10 effort. And in a climbing gym setting, if you have access to a gym that has lead routes that are 10 or 15 meters in length, that's like the perfect length. If it's a hard sport climb, if you don't stop to shake out and rest, if you just kind of gun for the anchors, you will be training in this category, that 1 to 3 minute near all-out effort. Here at our house, well, we don't have rope climbing at our house, of course, so again, the treadwall is our platform of choice, though we also use our bouldering wall, and sometimes we'll do laps on the bouldering wall just to kind of mix things up, perhaps trying to connect a few boulder problems together in, say, a minute and a half of nonstop, pretty high power output climbing. But I prefer the tread wall because it's more measurable in terms of distance climbed. And again, we can kind of remove some of the technical aspects and concentrate more on high power movements. And if you haven't gained a sense already that I'm a big fan of having access to a tread wall, I can't really stress enough how great of a tool it is. I think even climbing gyms, commercial climbing gyms should have a few tread walls set up because it's not only a very useful tool for various testing, but it's a great training tool that really lends itself to doing interval training in a way that you really can't do so easily and in a repeatable, formatted way on a bouldering wall or on a roped climb. And so a tread wall is something that a serious coach or climber should look into. If you're at home and just have access to a pull-up bar or a fingerboard, this is a little tougher to train. If you do a long duration hangboard repeater protocol, where you hang for 15 seconds, rest for 5 seconds, and repeat that 4 to 8 times, you'll find that to be quite grueling, and that will be a pretty good long strength endurance category workout or session. You could do a couple of sets of that with about a 5-minute rest in between. You could do a 20-second hang and a 10-second recovery times 6. So do 6 of those in a row, which would take, I guess, about 3 minutes. And again, you'd want to rest at least as long as you train, a work-to-rest ratio of 1:1 to maybe even 1:3. And so, again, you're not going to get complete recovery, but you will get substantial recovery. If all you have is a pull-up bar, well, then you might alternate doing 15 seconds of pull-ups and 15 seconds of rest, and do that 6 times, and see how many aggregate pull-ups you can do in those 6 15-second sets. And that would take you basically about 3 minutes. And so that's something that you can record and gauge workout to workout and see if there's progress. Okay, so we're getting long here once again. This really is a supersized podcast, but supersized is a good thing when it comes to the Training for Climbing podcast. At least I hope you agree. In any case, let's wrap things up here. A few reminders, and these are some things I believe I mentioned in the previous podcast at the beginning. Number one is that this type of energy system training, using this as a conceptual model for setting up your workouts, it's a very powerful tool and way of doing things for an advanced climber, and even more so for an elite climber who is maybe approaching their genetic potential or certainly having difficulty advancing to the next grade. If you're at the other end of the experience spectrum, if you're a beginner or perhaps moving into the intermediate category, yeah, training is important, but this level of nuance is not necessary just yet. You need to focus on becoming a better climber, technically and mentally, and just improving your general fitness and your climbing strength on a wall, and not getting bogged down with long, grueling workouts that might get you injured or stunt your growth as a climber. And so just a little word of warning there. Number two, the terminology I'm using in this podcast might not align perfectly with what other coaches are saying, or perhaps what you learned in school or read it in a exercise physiology textbook. And some of that can be regional differences or stylistic differences, and some of it might just be old science that the old textbooks or coaches are still using or talking about. Whereas what I'm presenting to you here is the latest research, the latest terminology, the latest state of the science, at least as I understand it. And I can't guarantee that it's 100% perfect, but I think it's as high quality as is probably available for a climber at this stage of the game, though there are certainly some other excellent coaches out there working on this stuff, and that should be considered and listened to as well. I'm not claiming to have a monopoly on this knowledge, that's for sure, but I do put a lot of hard work into making it research-based and tapping into the latest science and trying to move training for climbing into the future. Number three, when it comes to energy system training, well, we're all a little different. And so it does help to have a coach to work with you, to help design a program that is best for you. Obviously, an analysis of your climbing technique and your strengths and weaknesses is where you need to start in terms of the process of improving as a climber. But taking your finger strength and your pulling power and your core strength and your aerobic power, taking all of those to the next level, yes, that is important too in terms of opening up the next grade of climbing for you. So the best program is probably one that you're not doing right now, and it's likely going to be a program that is multifaceted and not just focused on stronger fingers. There is certainly more to the game than that. Number four, if this is your prime climbing season, if this is where you live the best weather for climbing outside, or if you're heading soon into your road trip season as we are as a climbing family, well then this is not the time to dive into an all-out training block. You might dabble with some of these workouts and play around with them, but during performance season, you have to always remind yourself you can't cram when it comes to training. If you try to do that, you're going to end up at the crags fatigued and not 100% and really kind of shoot yourself in the foot, I guess you might say. You want to train hard during the winter. If you're going to ever really push the envelope and be on the edge of overtraining, you would want to do that during the off season. And during the on-season, during the performance season, take the opposite approach and err on the side of, if anything, under-training and over-resting a little bit. Ideally, you want to show up at the crags and be 100% fresh on the day you're there to send your project, or on the day you arrive at your climbing destination where you're going to spend a few weeks during your summer season. Okay, final closing comments. Number one, of course, is to listen to this podcast again. Both episode number 23, which was the first part of this long podcast, and this episode, there's a ton of content, a ton of information, and you just can't absorb it and assimilate it and learn how to apply it all in one listen. So, return to these podcasts, listen to them a few times over, and hopefully each time you'll pick up something new and gain a new distinction. And that will empower you as a self-coach and hopefully help grow you as a climber. Of course, please do share this information with your friends because, why shouldn't they benefit as well? I've put a lot of work into these podcasts and they're free, so why not pass them on to as wide an audience as possible? And, of course, if you enjoyed this podcast or a previous podcast, please leave a review on iTunes. The more, the better. The more stars, the better. I really appreciate that, friends. And do visit my website. If you go to trainingforclimbing.com and search around, you'll see a lot of good articles and videos and a wide range of material on mental training and technique training and nutrition and recovery. There's a lot there. And there's even a newsletter you can subscribe to get a monthly update from me, and a free ebook from me as well. Later this month, I'll be recording the next round of Ask Coach Hurst. So if you'd like to submit a brief, specific question, you can go to my Twitter feed at Train4Climbing. That's TRAIN, 4 climbing. And pinned to the top is a post about Ask Coach Hurst, and you can leave your question as a comment to that pinned post. And finally, I wanted to let you know that I have a new hangboard coming out. It's called the Ultimate Hangboard. It's made by Nicros. I spent the past year designing this hangboard and refining the shape of each hold, and it's got a good variety of options in terms of different size crimp and pocket holds to train on. I think it has ultimate combination of holds that for most climbers will provide an ideal platform for at-home training. And so you can learn more about the Ultimate Hangboard on my website, trainingforclimbing.com, or at nicros.com. It's not there yet, but it will show up early this summer, so keep an eye out for details. Well, that does it for this episode of the Training for Climbing podcast. I sure hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, be safe, be strong, and train on.